I'm George Galloway and I present Kalima Horra on Mayadeen television. Here we are in London. I speak my words freely, either in Parliament, on television, here on the streets of London. Kalima Horra means free word. That's what I speak. So Kalima Horra is a two-way conversation. Check it out on Mayadeen television. Welcome to Kalima Horra with me, George Galloway, on Mayadeen television, coming to you from London, discussing Europe and the world. We have here discussed before what would Britain be like after Brexit. It's probably overdue that we take a look at what Europe will be like after Brexit. It has long been something of an enigma to me that Europe has never had the weight in political affairs that would be commensurate with its economic and cultural importance. Maybe that was because Britain was in the European Union with its, well, shall we say, special relationship with the United States of America. Will the EU, sans the UK, be a more independent player in world affairs, therefore? Or will Europe, weakened by Britain's exit, actually grow weaker on the international stage? It's an important question. Europe is a collection of some of the once most important countries in the world, and still some of the world's biggest economies. So I'm joined, as always, by a panel of distinguished experts. I'm merely the enthusiastic amateur. Johnathan Fryer, you are a partisan of the European Union, fought hard to avoid Britain leaving it. You worked in Brussels for a time as a journalist and broadcaster with Reuters. You're a Liberal Democrat politician, author of 15 books, I must say, very impressive haul, as well as being a Liberal Democrat politician. How would you answer that question? Will Europe, after Brexit, be a stronger or weaker power in world affairs?
I think inevitably, to begin with, there's going to be a period of consolidation. We have to remember that all of Europe is affected by the coronavirus problem, and that is really the centre of attention at the moment. The rollout of vaccines has been very slow on the continent compared with Britain, and that will be inevitably at the top of the list. The other thing which is really important is that, of course, that Angela Merkel, who's been the sort of mother of Europe for the last decade and a half, is going to cease to be Chancellor of Germany beginning of next year. We now know who her successor will be, a fairly centrist figure who will probably keep more or less the same sort of policies. And I think we will see France and Germany asserting themselves as the lead motors in the European Union. But we have to bear in mind that there are countries who are, shall we say, being difficult. Hungary, Poland, for example, which are in many ways...
Italy also?
Potentially Italy, perhaps, but certainly Hungary and Poland, who are challenging some of the basic tenets of the European Union. So I think it's going to take several years before the EU is really able to assert itself, least of all able to assert itself on the common foreign and security policy, which has always been a long dreamed of goal, but is far from being achieved as yet.
Let me test you on one point. Are Franco and German interests the same? You see, the whole basis, really, of the European Economic Community, as it first was to, if you like, bridge a historic gap. Germany invaded France 3 times in 100 years. Will German and French foreign policy always be in line?
I don't think they will, no, largely because the French foreign policy is increasingly assertive in large parts of Africa and in other parts of the world, and veering away from the German approach, which is much more neutral and not getting directly involved in different situations. So I think that's going to be a real challenge, particularly if Emmanuel Macron stays on for another term as president.
Do you think he will?
I think he's going to find it difficult to win the election next time. It
Me
depends.
too. Robert Oulds, you are in a way the antithesis of Johnathan. You are a lifelong opponent of the European Union from the think tank, the Bruge Group, founded in 1989. And so more or less all of my parliamentary life had the Bruge Group breathing down the necks of pro-European governments. But you don't, I'm assuming, wish Europe ill. You presumably would like it to have, in a multipolar world, its proper measure of respect and importance. But do you think it will achieve that?
Well, the European Union is unaccountable, it's undemocratic. That's one of the essential reasons for the EU. It's about taking power away from ordinary people and amassing it around an elite.
Away from the nation state.
Which is the only really democratic actor that exists. There needs to be a national demos for people to be fully engaged in politics. This takes it a step away from ordinary people. And to give that organisation a military capability, as they've already got to a small degree, is actually worrying. And it is an expansionist organisation and wants to push its borders out. We've seen how it took in Ukraine, which provoked a war with Russia, which then ended up dismembering part of that country because of its reckless ambition and to push it itself and expand its borders. The European Union has an agenda and it doesn't actually stop. So the European Union is actually sort of something that is a source of worry on the foreign policy. The last thing we would want it to have is its own military capability, because they're unaccountable, they're undemocratic, and we've seen how leaders, when they don't have checks and balances placed upon them, can become military adventurists.
You can have a foreign policy which can be influential without having an army, of course. Germany has no real military capability and is constitutionally obliged not to exercise it for obvious reasons, any power that it does have. Can Europe nonetheless be a force for good in the world?
Well, it hasn't shown that in its policies that it's gone on other European nations. We've seen how the economic and monetary union has impoverished southern Europe. That is not a force for good when there are massive dole queues, massive debt crisis, people having to eat out of their bins just to get by when the crisis was at its peak earlier the last decade, and could well be going into a similar economic death spiral. So it is hardly something that is a moral organisation or something that's a force for good. And we've seen other countries in Europe, such as Norway, that's not a part of the European Union, that is very influential on the world stage because they are neutral. They don't have an agenda and they will talk with anybody and they will bring people together. So one doesn't have to have some big bloc talking to other nations to have an effect. Norway is a great example of how one can be a fair player and have far more influence than larger nations who are somewhat bellicose.
He's not finished with dismembering the European Union yet, Johnathan. Clive Menzies, an economic and political analyst, joins us also. Clive, thanks for coming on board. What about this point that Johnathan made? Never mind the European Union playing a role in the world, places like Hungary and Poland and maybe Italy are inching at least towards the exit from the European Union.
Well, I think that has been a sort of grassroots movement across Europe. There are sizable proportions of each population that is unhappy with Europe. But I think what we're talking about here is a global context. And there is a war going on. And this war has probably been going on for a long time, but has really escalated in the last few years. And that is the war of centralization versus decentralization. And I think when you talk about democracy, national democracy is a form of centralized power in a national context, and it's still undemocratic in spite of, it's probably more democratic than the European Union. But what we're seeing through the internet and through monetary systems, alternative money systems, is a move away from centralized hierarchies organization, because it's money power, centralized control of money, which provides all the incentives, which creates all the problems in the world. So I think in terms of the European Union, if you look at the context, through the 20th century, it was always planned as a building block towards a one world government. And the UN is another manifestation of that ambition. But what we're seeing is increasingly people beginning to question that thesis of centralized power and our self-organizing money systems and other systems as an alternative. Now, it's very small at the moment and certainly not recognized by most mainstream commentators, but it is undoubtedly happening. If you look at the crypto world, there are many, many alternative currencies. I suspect none of them have a long-term future, but they're stepping stones towards a decentralized environment. So I think Brexit was, if you like, a mark in the sand in this war between centralized power and people, because people are quite capable of organizing and looking after themselves. And all of these directives attempt to create a one-size-fits-all policy for human relationships and activities that are infinitely nuanced and fluid and evolving. And so rules and regulations don't actually work. And that's what we're finding with so many aspects of the world. And so the EU is all about regulation. And to think that we've left Europe is something of a mistake, because military unification has gone on, security unification continues. There is absolute lockstep alignment across Europe. And you talk about Germany being demilitarized. The militarization of Europe is taking place under our very noses, but it's never reported in the mainstream media. You go and look at UK Column, they've done extensive analysis. There's a guy called Richard Ellis, I can't remember his organization, that dissects and explains exactly how military unification has been accomplished with the UK's involvement, although cosmetically PESCO we're not part of, but in every other respect we're in lockstep with Europe. So I would say we've had Brexit without the exit.
That's a good line. Let's go to the United States, to New York. Willem Buiter is a visiting professor of international affairs at Columbia University and a former member of the Monetary Policy Committee of the Bank of England. Willem, thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
The UK is a decent-sized power in international events, got a permanent seat in the Security Council, for example, of the United Nations. How will the EU cope with Britain's departure?
There is no doubt that Brexit has weakened the European Union. The European Union was always the poor global superpower because of its failure to establish a proper internal market, even with the UK as a member. We're still very far from having a single 27 country now European economy. We still have 27 national economies coexisting awkwardly. But there's no doubt that it has been diminished by the UK's departure, and that unless it takes steps to deepen its internal integration among the remaining 27 member states, it will be a diminished global player, and it will be further away from being a global superpower.
Without Britain, where does the EU stand on the global stage?
Well, it would be a second-tier player after the US and now increasingly also China, with a diffused, non-unified voice speaking on key issues that affect all 27 countries, but do not lead to a common response. So I would say that the EU is now a second-tier superpower in economic affairs.
Will Russia and other emerging powers take advantage of the division between Britain and Europe?
Well, I wouldn't call Russia a superpower. China, yes. Russia, no. But remember, the fact that the EU is diminished by the UK's departure doesn't mean that there is a corresponding gain for other countries or other regions. There is a net global loss in terms of the ability to create wealth and to interact in constructive ways in a range of markets and for a wide variety of goods and services. So I would say, yes, the bargaining position of China when dealing with the EU has been strengthened by the UK's departure. UK itself has very limited bargaining power, right? It's not even a large European country. It's a middle-sized European economy, right? So the notion that it would have significant bargaining power in its dealings with the true superpowers in the world is an illusion. But the most noticeable effect of it all is the diminished bargaining power of the EU 27.
Will the US under Biden benefit from Brexit?
Again, the US will, when it strikes its trade deals with the UK, right, will get slightly more favorable terms than it would have gotten, than it did get when the UK was part of the EU 27, simply because the UK is a weak negotiator. It's a middle-sized European country which cannot hold its own in serious negotiations with a superpower like the US. So yes, the US gets some advantage there, but the US again loses from the fact that we're further away from a single pan-European market and will remain further away from that for the foreseeable future.
Johnathan, you see in this conversation the fundamental contradiction. The professor in New York thinks that the EU has to unify much more strongly. Robert thinks the nation state is the way forward, more or less the polar opposite. Clive doesn't even really fancy the nation state, thinks that we can devolve power still further. This is, in microcosm, the big debate, isn't it? Where do you find the best balance between decentralization and centralization?
Well, I think it would come about if the EU actually put into practice what in principle has been its policy for many years, awful name, subsidiarity, but basically is the principle that decisions should be taken at the lowest appropriate level, so that far from centralizing on everything and deciding everything in Brussels, things should be decided at regional, local level, or sometimes at the state level. I think it is the state that is going to lose if subsidiarity does happen. But I think it's very interesting just listening to the professor there from New York and bearing in mind the President, Joe Biden, has made it very clear that he intends to really snuggle up to the European Union, that he sees the European Union as a great partner for the future. Britain, a little bit on the side, is going to
He won't be there that long, though.
Perhaps not, but I doubt whether Kamala Harris would take a particularly different line on that. I think they see, particularly given the rise of China, that the natural alliance is between the European Union and the United States. And the United States does see the European Union as a body, even if it's not a political entity as such, at least at the moment. The United States does see it as one and would far rather deal with the European Union than individually with member states. So I think that's quite an important thing. But it really is essential for the EU, if it's going to have any future at all, that it makes subsidiarity work. Because otherwise, the demos that's been referred to, the ordinary people, are going to be fed up with decisions that are taken far away from them and often not with real consultation. But if the system is changed, then that could be different.
The Polish and Hungarian examples that you yourself gave are, in a way, an example of subsidiarity not being implemented, because these are essentially cultural, socio-cultural conflicts that Poland and Hungary have with Brussels. They're not fundamental to being in a union if subsidiarity meant something.
The problem is, though, that if subsidiarity is in conflict with core principles of the European Union, remember, to be a member of the European Union, you have to accept the so-called Copenhagen criteria, and that is a multi-party democracy, independent judiciary, the sorts of freedoms which are being challenged in Budapest and to a lesser extent in Warsaw. And that is why there is a clash between that wish for subsidiarity and challenging core principles of the Union.
Maybe the constant expansion of the EU was a mistake, therefore. Mightn't it have been better for the EU to stick with the core Western European countries that largely founded it?
Yeah, I think that, for example, the expansion to Bulgaria and Romania happened too early, before they were ready for it. But we have to remember the context, the wider context. These were countries that had been under communist rule for decades, and in several cases very much under the thumb of the then Soviet Union. And the feeling was in Brussels and in national capitals like London at the time that we have to welcome them, get them into the family quickly before they choose some other sort of route.
More of this after the break. Stay tuned. You're watching Kalima Horra with me, George Galloway, on Mayadeen Television. Coming to you from London, talking about Europe, or rather Europe and the world. Will the EU have a greater or lesser impact in world affairs after Brexit? Or, Robert Oulds, maybe the question should be, should the European Union have a greater or lesser impact in the world? Let's deal first with the question as posed. Will it? Before hearing your argument, why it shouldn't. And if it shouldn't, what would be the impact, the net impact on world affairs if it didn't?
I don't believe the European Union will have a greater impact. With Britain's departure, it's lost a great source of revenue. It's lost not only Britain's contributions, which Britain was the second highest contributor to the European Union after Germany, into their funds, but it's also lost the ability to borrow using the Britain's credit rating and borrowing from the UK essentially and funding their schemes, their bailout schemes. Now, the economics of the European Union are simply all wrong. It has a single currency that doesn't work. This actually created more divergence. It's created a greater difference between the wealthy nations, particularly in the north, and the poorer nations in the south. Countries such as Greece now have 200% debt to GDP ratio. Italy's up to 130, and the situation is getting worse. It's not something that works economically, and so fundamentally it cannot, ultimately it will decline and fizzle away. 90% of global growth, when we're past this coronavirus pandemic will come outside of the European Union, not in the EU. Countries like Italy have had next to no increase in their GDP since they joined the euro now 20 years ago. So it cannot work because ultimately the numbers are all wrong. It's going backwards in terms of world affairs and will become less and less important as time goes by.
And as Johnathan himself pointed out, the rollout of vaccination in the European Union has been catastrophic. They're fighting each other. Even a country as commonly assumed efficient as Germany has vaccinated 1/5 of the number of people that we have. Sorry, 1/20 of the people that we have in Britain. So it's not working on many levels.
It's a slow and lumbering organisation. It's run by a bureaucracy and technocrats who think they know best, but are always unable to deliver. And we were told that if Britain left the transitional arrangements with the European Union, that if we Brexited fully, we wouldn't be getting a vaccine before European countries. The reverse was true. Almost everything the Remain campaign had said in terms of economic growth, every kind of prediction they got, the opposite was true. Their doom mongering about the future for the UK was just incorrect. Of course, we do have our problems with COVID-19, but really Brexit has been a success story so far. And going forward, we're pretty confident.
So far, it's only been a few weeks.
Well, it wasn't the mass crisis that we were predicting.
No,
the planes weren't falling out
true.
of the sky, and the ports are still open. Trade is continuing, mostly.
Let's go to Uppsala in Sweden and talk to Dr. Greg Simmons, who is the Associate Professor at the Department of Eurasian Studies at Uppsala University. Dr. Simmons, thanks for joining us. How will the impact of Brexit be felt in the EU?
Okay, well, I think Europe as such will not change dramatically in terms of what it does around the world, especially if we look at Europe, especially Britain is left the EU. So if we're looking at that specifically, then there is not going to be much that changes because Britain has done things without the EU before. If we're looking at Iraq and we're looking at these kinds of military interventions, it did that without the EU. And the EU, of course, is not a military entity, but rather a political economic one.
Do you think the EU will work closely with Britain in the future on foreign policy, or will they each go their different ways?
I mean, probably the problem for the EU is that it'll lose quite a source of funding as the fees that Britain paid into the EU will no longer be there. So this may affect the capacity of the EU in terms of its ability for foreign policy and so forth. But otherwise, I mean, Europe is not a united entity. It never has, and it'll probably never will be, because it's even though when one talks of Europe, you get this idea of this homogeneous one people, etc. And this is encouraged because if we look at one of the main points which has been emphasized is this slogan for the EU to talk with one voice. The EU is constituted over well over 20 members, which means it doesn't have a united set of interests and goals. My main point would be, I think, it'll be able to do less than it has before, because unless there is some kind of agreement for Britain and the EU to enter into. So, I mean, we're looking at foreign policy, especially in the close neighborhoods, like we're talking about Ukraine or Belarus or the Middle East, North Africa. these kinds of places.
Will the new superpowers like China benefit from Brexit?
Actually, both Russia and China, and this is before Brexit, perceived Europe as a weakening power already. And this is owing to the general decline of the US-led global hegemony, which Europe is under the umbrella of. And one can see that there has been a lot of overextension in terms of the capacity. There's also the different crises which cannot be resolved, economic, immigration, these points of view. So, I mean, there are existing and seemingly unsolvable, at least in the present point of time, crises which affect Europe. But Europe also shows weakness because they were absolutely indecisive and wringing their hands when Trump unilaterally withdrew from the Iranian nuclear deal. Europe was left sitting on its hands, unable to do anything effectively. So, I mean, this works both ways. I mean, not only what other countries do to Europe, but what Europe is doing to it, what should be doing but is not doing with other countries.
Do you think we could see finally the creation of a rapid reaction force in the EU anytime soon?
Yes. Well, I mean, this was one of the things which really drove a driving force for the EU, I mean, the UK to leave the EU. I remember speaking with a former Scotland Yard detective. It was an interesting conversation because I undiplomatically brought up the Brexit issue. And so he said, okay, I'm a Europeanist. Okay, so then I asked, how did you vote? I voted for leave. And I said, okay, how do you balance these points? And he goes, well, I believe in the European community and these economic interrelations. But I think he said, I think the EU has become too bureaucratic and unaccountable. And he said the final straw for him was this proposition of a European army, which in the British mentality brings up memories of Napoleon and Hitler, because historically these are the points. And this shows a lack of awareness and understanding from the EU about these historical pressure points of some of its members. And yeah, it cost them this time.
Clive, that's the nub of the issue, isn't it? That the EU and Europe actually is not united, has never been united, and will never be united. How can 27 countries, now 8 as it was, have a common foreign policy? Because everyone comes at these matters from a different perspective and with different interests.
Well, yeah, I think that's a very complex discussion, and I'll try and keep it as simple as possible. But in essence, all the levers of power are controlled. So to a certain extent, the battle between the EU and nation states is choreography in itself. But if you think about it, and I thought you're picking up on subsidiarity, which Johnathan leapt on, is quite ironic, because subsidiarity came out to avoid the Conservative Party splitting itself asunder under John Major, if you remember the controversy at the time. And I won't go into the language that he used that was quite graphic. But in essence, you're right. The thing is, you look at Britain, you think about people in the north, people in Wales, people in Cornwall. We all have very different identities. That is even more extreme in Europe. That doesn't mean to say that we can't be friends. And the question is, do we want to live exactly like the Italians or the Greeks or whoever?
I'll take one of those or either, yeah.
Yeah,
there are others I'm not that keen on.
Well, I love living in Europe or spending time in Europe. And I think there is such richness and diversity. And the problem is that you're trying to squeeze a political economic framework around very different cultures. And yes, we can align to certain principles. And I think this idea of liberalism that EU manifests itself, I think is looking excellent in France, with the French police habitually maiming and in some cases killing yellow vest protesters since 2018. What's liberal about that? And yet France is at the heart of the European Union. So I think there are a great many illusions that are created. You also said, you know, Europe can't get its act together in order to vaccinate anything like the number in the UK. I would say Europeans should be very grateful for that, because these COVID vaccinations haven't been properly tested. They haven't been tested in the case of where they mix with other drugs. There was a study in 2012 which showed these are RNA alterating. They alter your genetics.
We're not going to have a debate about vaccination and the coronavirus. You're saying it's a good thing.
I'm saying that Europe, if it's taking its time, maybe it's deliberating over some of these points, or it may just be incompetence or inefficiency.
I think it may be the latter. Dr. Simmons, you're a European. You've taught in Eastern Europe. You're in Sweden now. You're in a good position to tell us, what do ordinary Europeans think about Brexit?
A very diverse feeling, because it matches the diversity here. I mean, the EU is a liberal project, so those with a liberal sentiment tend to be having a sort of regret about the Britain leaving the EU, because this is a slap in the face for liberalism in this particular the connection. However, it becomes a little bit more nuanced when you go elsewhere, and especially if you go into Eastern Europe, where the EU projects itself as this kind of liberal, a kind of bastion of values and norms. And so you got this assumption that these should be a universal set of norms and values. But this is not the case in Eastern and Central Europe, because they're still much more culturally and socially conservative. And so, I mean, and you can see this, what's happening in Poland, Czech Republic, Hungary, but you also the more pro-EU ones like Romania, which do not like some of the aspects of liberalism, but see the EU as a protection, a shelter against possible Russian influence. So it's more of a geopolitical orientation than a value orientation. And a lot of in the Brussels do not understand this. And so, yeah, I mean, they can sympathize with that, because they also think that the EU, I mean, you got this kind of reinvention of EU as EU SSR. So after the Soviet Union, because you got this bureaucratic monster which is wreaking havoc and sort of killing any kinds of initiative and innovation in society. So, I mean, they're a bit more sympathetic. And of course, conservative-minded people are more positive about the EU, I mean, UK leaving the EU. So, I mean, it's quite a varied mixture depending on one's personal beliefs, ideology, and worldview.
Johnathan, it is the fundamental question, isn't it? That you're trying to impose not just an economic homogeneity on 27 countries now, but a cultural one. You're a liberal, I'm not. Why should you be able to impose your liberalism on me? Why should the liberal nostrums of the European Union be imposed on Hungary or Poland?
Well, certainly a key element of the European Union is what's enshrined in the Lisbon Treaty of celebrating diversity. So you don't, absolutely not making everybody the same. That is not the ideal. But nonetheless, there are certain core principles which are seen as universal, but maybe they are only European, because after all, what we see happening in China these days and in many parts of the Arab world doesn't concur at all with these European principles of freedom of expression, of freedom before the law.
Julian Assange would have something to say about our principles of freedom of expression.
I think there is that element of diversity, but we have to be honest and recognise it's going to get more difficult because the next countries due in are from the Western Balkans. So you've got countries like Bosnia-Herzegovina and Albania.
What could
queuing
possibly
up to
go
join.
wrong?
What could possibly go wrong? Exactly, because that really I think is going to be a huge challenge for the European Union to maintain any sort of common political identity if they go ahead with that expansion into the Western Balkans, which they said they will do, but not immediately. And of course, now with COVID, it's going to be even further down the road.
Might have been better to just remain a trading bloc rather than this inexorable movement towards what is effectively super-statehood.
I think probably it will go back to being more of a trading bloc, acknowledging that the move towards political integration was too early and too fast. People weren't ready for it, and they're still not ready for it. And therefore, I think the EU does have to rethink what it's there for. And the economic issues are clearly at the heart of what the European Union is for and what it does as the biggest trading bloc in the world. And for that reason, it will always have clout on the world stage. But I think they will have to put the brakes on the political side of things, because otherwise it's not going to work.
Robert, that's quite an interesting admission, not a confession, but an acknowledgement by Johnathan, a partisan of the European Union, that they are going to have to rethink. Do you think they will rethink, or are they going to sail on until further splinters exist within their organisation?
Well, the European Union is very dogmatic, and people in Brussels, which is the base of the bureaucracy, the European Commission, which is really the driver of European integration, they exist in their own bubble. There you can work in there, you can sleep in the offices, people you can go to the laundry. You never actually have to leave the offices. You can spend their whole life there, and they talk to themselves. They are not in touch with public opinion. Indeed, if there is a public opinion where they vote against the European Union, they're told to vote again, or their vote is ignored. So the answer would be yes, the European Union should put the brakes on and reverse somewhat, but they won't, because they are so dogmatic. Whenever they create a problem through more Europe, their answer is yet more Europe to try and fix the problem that they've created, which then creates other problems down the line. They're on a one-track towards European Union centralisation. That's the key issue. It's not so much about a superstate, it's about power being handed to technocrats who think they know best. And increasingly, people will get agitated, people will be, just like the British were, say, no more of this. It's gone too far. It had gone far from the vision which we originally supported, which would have been just trade, and became one about political union. And that's something that will become untenable. So at some point, things will gradually move, very gradually, but there will be some big bang in the future where countries will just have to exit the single currency and maybe even exit the EU. But gradually, over time, it will fade away, because other countries will say, we just can't be doing your slow bureaucratic policies. We need action. National governments will have to develop their own policies and look after their own people as best they see fit.
Including foreign policy.
Including foreign policy, and that will then be the death knell of the European Union, and it will fade away essentially. But of course, for the time being, they are just on this one track forwards to ever closer union. But that will just create more and more problems, and they won't be able to speak with one voice, because the European Union has so many different countries that have different outlooks. Britain would be looking a global nation, would be close to the United States. Other countries, Greece, have a historic friendship and cultural similarity in terms of religion with countries like Russia, whereas Eastern European countries are closely aligned to Sweden and Germany. and France and really is more closely aligned in a sense in the Romance language and culturally to each other rather than Germany. So there are all these fault lines that exist in the EU and they just cannot be solved, and they have not been solved by European integration. They thought that with the central institutions of the EU taking more power, that people's loyalties would go to those European Union institutions. The reverse is true. It creates more tensions between nation states. So ultimately, these will bubble up to the surface and there will be fissures emerging, and the European Union will eventually break up, perhaps in a long time, but it's unsustainable economically, politically and socially as well.
Johnathan, on that point, nobody thinks of themselves as a European, do they? I mean, they think of, everyone has multiple identities, of course, and we were born and live on the continent of Europe, but there's nobody carrying, beyond a few zealots, there's nobody who goes around imagining that they have more in common with a Bulgarian or a Montenegrin than they have in common with somebody from Middlesbrough or Edinburgh, do they?
No, well, I mean, I suppose you probably include me amongst those zealots of the people who do feel a European identity, but it's a different layer of identity. I feel very much a Londoner, live here and work here. I feel very much British. I feel very much European. So when I go to Bulgaria, for example, I feel as though I'm at home.
Really?
I really do. Yeah. And I don't find any consistency.
I find it wonderful, but I don't at all feel at home.
Can I just
Clive?
add something? I think we're all human, and I have very good friends, and through the work that I do, I speak and spend a lot of time with many people from many different countries. And what unifies is our humanity, not where we live. And so I think that's a non-question. Do I feel European? No, I don't feel European. I feel human. And I have the same sort of feelings towards people of any other nationality if they happen to have values and give off an aura or a vibe.
Yes, but you wouldn't have a common foreign policy with them.
Well, I don't think anybody should have a foreign policy.
Well, yeah, I gathered that from your opening remarks.
That's what,
in fact, you don't even think there should be a state, do you?
No, I don't.
That's pretty avant-garde.
Well, it's why the reason it's avant-garde is because it's so dangerous to the people that actually control all the levers of power. If people stood up and said we are quite capable of organising ourselves and taking responsibility for us, I think we are.
How do we do that? How does 66 million people in Britain, for example?
Quite easily, if we didn't have the financial framework that we have at the moment. The problem is our financial framework. Money is rationed. We can only get money by obtaining it from a third party, banks. And there's no magic about creating money. And we're working with Bulgarian people and many other people on how we decentralize money, where everybody has access to money. Because if everybody has access to money, everybody has access to the means to life, and they can then live in harmony with each other, supporting each other. And you wouldn't need a foreign policy, you wouldn't need armies, you wouldn't need a state.
What about, so therefore no borders? You believe in abolishing borders?
I think it's a very different paradigm that one will need to envisage, and it takes a while to get your head around. But the idea of physical borders is quite useful in terms of sharing the commons, because one of the fundamental problems in the world is that the commons are taken from us and then rented back to us. And therefore, if you have we're very lucky on an island because we could actually share the value of the commons nationally. So you might need some sort of framework within which to do that.
But no navy to defend it.
Yeah, but broadly speaking, if the world is operating on the basis of different incentives, then you remove the cause of conflict because everybody's competing for money.
What do we call this philosophy of yours?
It's misunderstood because it's really anarchy, but all anarchy means is no ruler. And that is why anarchy is demonized as chaotic and violent and all the rest of it. But it's a very different philosophy. Murray Bookchin is a man worth reading, who was a former Marxist.
Yeah.
Are you familiar with
Anarchy in the UK, that was the Sex Pistols, wasn't it? Hey, Johnathan, the very final word to you. I sense that you are pessimistic, perhaps for the first time, about the future of the European Union, including its ability to influence international affairs. Have I misread you?
No, I think to a degree it's true. In the short term, I think the EU is going to go through a very difficult period, facing the numerous crises that it will. But I'm optimistic about the long-term future of the European Union. I think as an institution, it's significant. It can adapt if the political will is there among the member states. And I think it will need to, because otherwise Europe is going to become less and less important on the world stage. And that would be really bad news.
Well, you can make up your mind whether it would be really bad news, just bad news, or good news. We've certainly not found agreement here, but I hope you enjoyed the debate. This has been Kalima Horra for Mayadeen Television from London with me, George Galloway.